we're plunging into Ron Suskind's incredible book, The Way of the World, a story of truth and hope in an age of extremism. Now, that title might sound pretty heavy, I know, but he's a master storyteller. He weaves together this really intricate narrative through the eyes of actual people grappling with huge global events. He shows us that the complexities of our world, they aren't just played out in headlines, they're felt in these deeply personal struggles. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to pull out those core insights. What's Suskind really telling us about the search for truth, about the nature of power? And maybe most importantly, where can we actually find hope in a world that often feels, well, chaotic? We've got a lot of fascinating ground to cover.
We really do. And what's so compelling about The Way of the World is exactly that shift in perspective you mentioned. It doesn't just stay at the 30,000-foot view grand strategy from D.C. It takes us from inside the Oval Office right down to the back alleys of Pakistan or even the cells of Guantanamo. It really pushes us to look beyond the simple narratives and consider the very nuanced human dimensions of these global struggles. The book argues, I think, quite powerfully that by understanding these individual experiences, we actually grasp a much larger, much more complex reality. 1. The intelligence labyrinth. Rolf and the nuclear threat.
Okay, so let's kick things off with someone who really brings that word extremism in the title into stark, chilling relief. Rolf Mowatt-Larssen. He's a CIA veteran. And his take on the threat of nuclear terrorism is, frankly, terrifying.
Rolf is, he's a really singular figure. Suskind paints him vividly. Former paratroopers, fluent in 4 languages, a skilled pianist even, and this deeply philosophical mind. And crucially, he's one of the very few people who's actually run operations against both the Soviet Union and Al-Qaeda. That's quite a resume. And it's Rolf who states it, just bluntly, that a nuclear event in a major U.S. city is, quote, not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. That's not hyperbole coming from him. It really forces you to stop and think. How blind are we, collectively, to this ongoing threat?
That is a truly terrifying assertion. So what exactly did Rolf see as the critical blind spot? What led him to such a dire conclusion?
He believed it really came down to a critical failure in human intelligence. Specifically, he saw this stunning lack of penetration into groups like Al-Qaeda. After 9/11, Suskind reports Rolf saying the U.S. had only successfully developed 3 human spies inside Al-Qaeda. Just 3. He himself helped manage one, codenamed Lovebug, who was a Kurd associated with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Rolf was constantly asking, how do we find more Lovebugs? How do we cultivate that deep, on-the-ground intelligence that could actually prevent a catastrophe?
And it was this gap, this lack of eyes and ears inside that led to his famous Armageddon test idea, wasn't it? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a really striking detail Suskind brings out, Rolf's Armageddon test. He basically wanted to know, realistically, how long would it take an undercover team to get their hands on enough highly enriched uranium HEU to build a Hiroshima-sized bomb? We're talking about like 35 pounds for a sophisticated device. And his proposal was radical for the time. Send teams out covertly to actually try to buy the stuff and try to smuggle it into the U.S. Obviously not to detonate it, but to prove definitively that it could be done. It was meant as a, quote, shock to the system, to expose this really uncomfortable truth that he felt needed to be very public without a lot of fingerprints on it, because in his view, everyone here and abroad absolutely needed to understand this vulnerability existed.
Wow. So he felt the government itself, the bureaucracy, couldn't actually conduct that kind of raw, honest self-assessment internally. Why did he think that?
He believed the system was just too tangled up in what Suskind calls self-defensive politicized urges, the fear of failure, right? The internal politics, the career implications, all of that, Rolf thought, would prevent officials from truly confronting such a devastating truth head-on without watering it down. Suskind really shows Rolf seeing this profound disconnect between the sheer gravity of the threat and the institutional willingness, or lack thereof, to acknowledge it starkly. So this story, right from the start, it lays bare one of Suskind's central arguments, that even with these huge critical threats like nuclear terror, the very systems designed to protect us can end up being blinded by their own internal politics, sometimes prioritizing self-preservation over facing a harsh reality. 2. Power, politics, and perception. Bush, Cheney, and the Iraq War.
Okay, so moving from those intelligence shadows into the full glare of the Oval Office, Suskind then gives us this fascinating look at President George W. Bush's decision-making. The book really highlights his reliance on, quote, gut decisions and instinct, often perhaps, over what Suskind terms analytical rigors.
Right, and this immediately makes you ask, what happens when instinct consistently overrides that careful analysis? Especially when you're dealing with the complexities of global power. Suskind gives this illuminating example. President Bush apparently wouldn't agree to wiretap Vladimir Putin. He genuinely saw Putin as a friend, despite the CIA recommending it. Suskind notes this as an early sign of an extraordinary dilemma.
Yeah.
It defined America's global posture under a president who had this powerful confidence as instinct, maybe less patience for deep analysis that contradicted it. It suggests that personal connections and deeply held beliefs could sometimes overshadow hard strategic intelligence.
But the narrative really takes a crucial turn when Suskind digs into the dynamic between President Bush and Vice President Cheney. What did Suskind uncover there? How did their different approaches shape things, especially around, say, the Iraq War?
Yeah, this is where Cheney's concept of structural latitude comes. It's a system he developed, ironically, based on his experiences way back in the Nixon White House. Cheney believed the real failure of Watergate wasn't the break-in itself or even the cover-up, but that President Nixon had been, quote, overbriefed, meaning given too much information that could potentially compromise his resolve, or maybe his moral authority, or just create a paper trail. So structural latitude was designed essentially to shield the president, to filter the information that reached him.
So Cheney's system created a kind of buffer around the president, shielding him from information that might contradict his gut feelings or challenge the administration's preferred narrative. It's a pretty provocative idea. Did Suskind explore the potential dangers of that kind of system beyond just the manipulated intelligence for Iraq?
Oh, absolutely. Connecting the dots, Suskind argues that Cheney's model intentionally made a president less accountable for his actions. It even suggested that, quote, accountability is not in every case a virtue, which is quite a statement. This, Suskind contends, created a situation where really crucial issues get handled inside government on two parallel tracks. There's a sort of false ledger for the public auditors, and then there's the real one behind closed doors. And this, Suskind argues, is precisely what led to the, quote, manipulated intelligence regarding the Iraq War. It wasn't just spin, it was structural. It's a powerful insight, isn't it? How that desire for control, for protecting the executive, can actually lead to rejecting inconvenient truths, sometimes with devastating global consequences.
And the book gives a really concrete example of this manipulation concerning the whole WMD narrative, right?
Yes, exactly. Suskind reveals how intelligence that flat out contradicted the WMD narrative was actively dismissed, pushed aside by the White House. He specifically highlights the account from the former Iraqi intelligence chief, Tahir Jalil Habbush. Habbush told intermediaries, quite plainly, that Saddam had no WMDs. And this information, remarkably, was initially received enthusiastically by the CIA's deputy director at the time. They thought it was credible. Yet the White House response, according to Suskind sources, was effectively, look, we don't want to hear things like that. Make this go away. It suggests it wasn't just about ignoring dissenting voices. It was about actively trying to shape reality to fit a policy that had already been decided on. 3. The human face of extremism. Usman's Ordeal and identity.
But how do these big, high-level decisions and manipulations actually ripple outwards? How do they affect the lives of ordinary people caught in the middle? Suskind masterfully shifts our focus again, this time to individuals like Usman Khosa. His experience is both really poignant and, frankly, eye-opening. Usman's a young, well-educated Pakistani immigrant. He's living in this apartment in D.C. that Suskind describes as sitcom-worthy, sharing it with a Jewish and a Christian roommate. His story becomes this powerful lens on identity and belonging in post-9/11 America.
And a really striking detail Suskind includes is how Usman, even though he's like poster child for the successful immigrant story, ambitious, educated, integrating, still faces what Suskind calls this cultural nearsightedness. There's this detail about him selling his father's beloved 1978 Toyota Corolla, a real symbol of family legacy, just to scrape together the money for his plane ticket to America. That detail immediately grounds his ambition in this profound personal sacrifice. He's exactly the kind of person you'd think America would embrace. In his experience after 9/11 tells a, well, very different story.
And his life takes this incredibly dramatic and just profoundly unfair turn when he gets detained by U.S. Park Police right near the White House. This wasn't just a quiet arrest, was it? It was public.
Exactly. He describes seeing the headline, like forming in the eyes of the onlookers. Pakistani terror suspect arrested at White House. Just instantly. And that visceral experience left him feeling, quote, captured by such views. Not just by the police physically, but by that instantaneous, fear-driven judgment from the public. It made him really question the validity of uninformed opinions, even those coming from powerful political figures, when those opinions could have such devastating real-world impacts on people like him. It really forces us, the readers, to confront how easily suspicion can just morph into perceived guilt in that kind of atmosphere, and how deeply damaging that is to someone's sense of belonging.
What happens next with Usman is fascinating, though, because he finds this way to push back, to challenge official narratives, even just from his DC apartment.
Yeah, his apartment, which his friends jokingly called the Pakistan government in exile, becomes this unexpected hub. They start relaying uncensored news back to Pakistan during General Musharraf's state of emergency. It really demonstrates the incredible power of what we now call open source information, right? How it can defy government control, especially when traditional media is shut down or constrained. It puts the role of just ordinary citizens into perspective, armed with maybe just internet access and a commitment to getting the truth out, how they can challenge official stories and provide an alternative view of reality. It shows how personal initiative can actually have a wider political ripple effect.
And Usman's own internal struggle, it culminates in this profound debate he has with his sister, Sadia, who had embraced a much stricter form of Islam. How did their differing views, rooted in such personal experience, capture that larger global tension?
That's a really powerful scene in the book. Sadia argues passionately for one truth, a truth derived directly from God's word. It offers clarity, certainty, an immutable framework in a confusing world. Usman, on the other hand, champions doubt. He sees doubt and the process of scientific learning as the real engines of human progress. Their conversation just vividly illustrates that ongoing tension between faith and reason, between seeking certainty and embracing open inquiry, and how individuals have to navigate these huge questions of belief and identity in a world that's changing so fast and often feels hostile. Usman's whole journey really highlights the profound human cost when these big global policy decisions collide with individual lives, forcing people to reevaluate who they are and what they believe about the nature of truth itself. 4. Bridging divides. Ibrahim's journey from Bamiyan to America.
Okay, so from Usman's search for belonging in America, Suskind then takes us to Mohammed Ibrahim Frotan. He's an Afghan exchange student, originally from Bamiyan, the place famous for the destroyed Buddhas. His cultural immersion in America is just full of these aha moments, often as much for us, the readers, as for Ibrahim himself as he tries to navigate this completely different world.
Ibrahim's story starts with this almost unimaginable detail, the stone shoes anecdote. It's incredibly powerful. After the Taliban came through and slaughtered elders in his village, he survived alone, and he learned to pack stones into the holes in his worn-out shoes just to keep going. That single visceral image immediately communicates the depth of his resilience, but also the stark, brutal reality of the world he came from. It sets up this profound contrast with the relatively safe, comfortable world he's about to enter in America.
Wow, that image, packing stones in his shoes, it just underscores the unimaginable hardship. How did Suskind then show the jarring contrast between that kind of survival and his first encounters with American culture?
His initial encounters are often both humorous and deeply revealing of that gap. For instance, he's utterly bewildered by cheerleaders at a high school soccer game. He just watches them with, quote, raging tidal reactions. Back in Afghanistan, he'd only ever seen men play soccer, and certainly nothing like American cheerleading. It just didn't compute. Later, he really struggles to understand Halloween. For him, having seen skeletons, real ones, and dead bodies back home due to the conflict, the idea of dressing up like that wasn't fun or pretend. It wasn't just cultural confusion. It was this profound clash between a sort of American innocence, maybe, and his own traumatic experiences.
Which really forces us to think, how do we bridge such huge cultural divides, especially when one person's everyday normal is another person's deep trauma?
Ibrahim's story really highlights that classic pattern for exchange students. The initial honeymoon phase, followed by the tougher adjustment phase. His early fascination gradually gives way to real cultural friction. He rebels in small ways, printing photos of naked women he found online, which shocked his conservative host family, defiantly refusing to eat pork. It ultimately leads to him having to leave that first host family. It wasn't really malice on anyone's part, Suskind suggests, but just a fundamental, maybe unavoidable misunderstanding of cultural norms and expectations on both sides.
But his journey doesn't stop there, right? He finds a different kind of connection later, a more sort of human solution with Jillian, the teenage mom he meets.
Indeed. That's a really touching part of the book. Jillian tells us this simple story, almost like a parable, about a boy on an island who's afraid of monsters, but he's eventually befriended by a daring girl who isn't afraid. And Ibrahim, immediately recognizing the parallel in their own unlikely friendship, asks her, "Is it a story about you and me?" It's a pivotal moment. Suskind uses it beautifully to show that even when grand political solutions or formal programs seem to fail, hope can still be found in just forging these basic human connections across vast differences, acknowledging shared vulnerability, finding common ground. Through Ibrahim, Suskind powerfully illustrates that real understanding often emerges not from policies or strategies, but from shared human experiences and just the simple willingness to listen to someone very different from yourself. 5. The battle for justice and moral authority, Guantanamo and beyond.
Our journey through the book now takes us into the legal and moral maze posed by institutions, specifically Guantanamo Bay. We see this through the eyes of two key figures, a lawyer, Candace Gorman, and an Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Abraham.
Right. Candace Gorman is a lawyer representing Abdul Hamid al-Ghazawi, who was a baker accused of being a terrorist. Over time, she essentially loses faith that the legal system, as it was set up for Guantanamo, could actually provide real remedies. She comes to describe the system starkly as built to keep the law at bay, at arm's length. There's this famous moment where she tells Ghazawi, somewhat cynically, that Americans seem more focused on the death of a has-been model named Ann Nicole Smith than on the plight of the detainees. And what's fascinating is this comment unexpectedly gets a sly smile from Ghazawi. Perhaps a moment of shared recognition of the absurdity, or just the profound disconnect between his reality in that cell and the American public's focus. It really makes you think about the difference between what grabs headlines and what truly matters for justice.
But the narrative takes another really crucial turn with Stephen Abraham. He wasn't a lawyer fighting from the outside. He was an intelligence professional inside the system, assigned to manage evidence for the Combatant Status Review Tribunals, the CSRTs. And he found something deeply troubling.
Yeah, Abraham realized the whole system was often based on what he memorably called Hall of Mirrors evidence. Imagine taking one single piece of information, maybe an unverified rumor, maybe a coerced statement from another detainee, maybe just an innocent fact taken out of context, and then bouncing it off multiple other questionable sources. Suddenly, that single flimsy reflection looks like a mountain of evidence, a condemning tableau, as Suskind puts it, even if there's no solid proof underneath it all. It created this illusion of evidence where very little or none actually existed.
So Abraham's courage, his willingness to speak out, directly challenged the very legitimacy of that detention system. What did that moment reveal, in Suskind's view, about how justice can fray when it bumps up against national security claims?
Abraham ultimately concluded and stated publicly in a declaration to the Supreme Court that the system was, quote, built, maybe intentionally, to fail at finding truth, that is. He risked his entire military career to expose the fact that basic legal standards just weren't being met. And this was a critical turning point. His declaration was a key factor that helped persuade the Supreme Court to reverse an earlier decision and agree to hear a major challenge to the suspension of habeas corpus, that bedrock legal right protecting against unlawful detention. His actions brought the focus right back to foundational principles: integrity, compassion, accountability, and questioned whether they were being properly applied, even in the name of national security. The Guantanamo chapters really underscore Suskind's broader point, that ethical compromises, even if made for security reasons, ultimately erode a nation's moral authority and the very principles it claims to stand for.
And the book's final thoughts on these kinds of institutional failures, they seem to extend beyond just Guantanamo, don't they? Offering maybe a different vision for how America could engage with the world.
Absolutely. The wider narrative brings in voices like Wendy Chamberlain, a former senior State Department official. She expresses this growing belief among many that traditional government-to-government sort of transactional solutions are increasingly failing to address the root causes of conflict and extremism. She actually pines for a return to something more like a non-transactional, do-the-right-thing foreign policy. She uses the Peace Corps as an example. The idea wasn't primarily about where we'd end up or what we'd gain strategically, she felt, but fundamentally about how we want to be in the world. It's really a call for rebuilding moral authority, for demonstrating a genuine commitment to people and principles, not just pursuing narrow strategic interests.
So when we step back and look at all these threads woven together, what does it all mean? You have Rolf's agent warnings about nuclear terror and the political inertia, the self-interest that can block uncomfortable truth. You have Bush's instinct-driven leadership and Cheney's calculated shaping of information within the halls of power. Then there is Usman's profound personal search for belonging and identity in a world suddenly seeing him as suspect. And Ibrahim's incredible journey, his cultural odyssey, finding connection not through policy but through simple human contact across huge divides. And finally, that fight for basic justice in Guantanamo, where individuals had to push back against systems seemingly designed to obscure truth rather than reveal it. Suskind brilliantly connects all these deeply personal stories to the biggest global issues we face.
Yeah, he really does. The book ultimately suggests that secrecy is a dying cult, that in our interconnected world, trying to hoard information or control the narrative is increasingly futile. And perhaps even more critically, Suskind argues that a failure of imagination, that inability to truly step into someone else's shoes, to empathize or envision radically different perspectives, remains America's greatest vulnerability. And while that will to power is always going to be a constant force shaping our world, Suskind seems to find hope, genuine hope, emerging from what he calls the human solution. That means making real contact with people who are not like you, seeking shared understanding, even when it's difficult, and ultimately realizing that in some fundamental way, everyone saves everyone. It's a powerful message about our deep interconnectedness and really our shared responsibility.